of the chapters is on early Christianity as a bookish religion. And in that chapter, what I emphasize is that the place of texts, the place of books and texts in early Christianity in a variety of ways is phenomenally different than what you find in virtually any other religious group of the time. Books and, we're accustomed to thinking that every religion, of course, will have its scriptures. Not so. In the history of humankind, most religions, and to this day, most religions don't have scriptures in the sense in which we think of them. That is, texts that are deemed a special authoritative text and that are and the reading of which forms part of the worship ritual. The only religious groups of the time for whom that was a feature, of course, was the Jewish practice of reading texts in the synagogues and then inherited in the Jesus movement and the early Christianity likewise inherits that practice. And so the reading of texts as a part of their corporate worship, that sets the synagogue and the church apart from the whole religious environment. In addition to that, the early Christian production and distribution of new texts. I mean, they not only read the scriptural text, which is what Christians come to call the Old Testament initially, but they also begin producing new texts. The ones that we know best, perhaps earliest, are the letters of Paul, and then Gospels and other writings. By one count that I made, looking at an index or a catalog of early Christian texts that we know about from the ancient world, by the middle of the 3rd century, well in advance of 200 books that we know about, that we either have in whole or in part or have references to. And this is a small little group. By the year 200, they're estimating early Christianity may have comprised 200,000 people, maybe. And by 250, we're talking about 250 at least that we know about, 250 new books being written, composed. So the production of new texts. And some of these texts likewise come to be treated as scripture, the writings that come to comprise eventually part of the New Testament. Letters of Paul, Gospels, and some others already by 150 to 200 are being treated as scripture. The effort that went into the copying and dissemination of texts, I talk about. Again, phenomenal. And again here, far out of proportion to the size of the group. Christians seem to have been maniacally involved in copying texts and distributing them translocally and exchanging them with one another. In the first 3 centuries, certainly, overwhelmingly, is the book roll or scroll, particularly for serious literary texts. Early Christians prefer the codex, the ancestor of our modern leaf book, for their writings, particularly for their most prized writings, for their scripture writings. You have examples of pagan, so to speak, use of the codex for texts, but they tend to be for, tables of medical recipes or astronomical tables or, sort of workaday things. But for high literature, they would think that the book roll is really a more elegant form. Early Christians throw that on its head, and they actually prefer the codex for the works that they prize the most highly. They use the book roll a little more freely for theological tractates, for other kinds of writings. By my count, perhaps if you look at the writings that are not part of their emerging scriptural canon, about 2/3 of the copies that we have of these sort of non-scriptural texts are codexes, so about 1/3 of them are book rolls. When you look at the copies of the texts that come to form part of the Old Testament or New Testament, it's about 95% are codexes. So it's a really remarkable thing. And whatever may have originally triggered it, whether it was some supposed pragmatic or whatever reason, it quickly becomes, I think, it becomes an iconic thing. That is a deliberate choice to make their scriptural texts in a book form that is countercultural. They could not have been ignorant of this. They had to have known that they were going against the tide, and it must have been quite deliberate. So that also is another aspect of the distinctively bookish nature of early Christianity.